For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashnee Moodley. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttner's View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Professor.
Morning.
The ANC is currently going through a phase of disarray. Do you think that the organization can survive this level of discord?
It's crossed my mind that the ANC may not survive. Or one can put it another way, can the ANC regenerate? If it survives, it may just be a party indistinguishable from other parties. But can it recover the image of and the character of an organization that excited people, where it was imbued with a moral vision that drew people to the organization? Some people will say, the ANC has had a lot of crises in the past and it has survived these. In the 1930s, for example, the ANC had more or less collapsed at the center under the leadership of Seme. And there'd been a crisis before that when Josiah Gumede, who had been president and became quite left-wing, he was removed. So that happened at the center, that there was a semi-collapse and paralysis. And recent research has shown that even if the ANC has had problems at its national center, it may well have had a powerful organizational life in the rural areas. There's a book by Peter Lim, ANC, the early years, which shows this very well. So they point to that, but I think it's very important for us to understand that for the ANC to become the preeminent organization of African nationalism particularly, took a long time, because before the ANC was formed, the precursors to the ANC in the Cape, Natal and so forth were overshadowed by the Ethiopian church movement, which had a mass organizational following and an Africanist type message, although it did have good relations with the Congress organizations and with the SANNC, the first name of the ANC when it was formed. But right down till about the late 1940s or the 1940s, the ANC was overshadowed by the Garveyites, the followers of Marcus Garvey, who had an Africanist message, drive the whites into the sea, and the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union. Although it's a union, in many ways it was a nationalist movement, and it may have had something like 250,000 members. Sometimes they would have these meetings and they would collect over £1,000, as it was then, in coins from those meetings. So the ANC was overshadowed right down until the period of the formation of the Youth League and the 1950s. So, and in fact, that short-lived period of having hegemony was interrupted by the banning and the ANC being illegal for 30 years. And that was a very difficult period with many people becoming demoralized because they had gone out of the country, been trained, and there was very little chance of them seeing military action except the short campaigns in Rhodesia, as it then was. South Africa didn't have any friendly borders that they could cross until Mozambique became independent in 1974. And what I think is interesting to ask ourselves is, if a large number of people went out of the country in this period prior to 1976, what happened in those difficult periods when people's morale was low? My understanding is that many people, or let's say a reasonable number of people, actually left the organization, some cases they came back later. Sometimes they left to acquire degrees and in the United States and other places, and prepared themselves for another life, either here or over there. So that when people speak of themselves being veterans of the struggle, it would be interesting to know how many of them were actually around in the very, very difficult period before 1976, between the 1969 Morogoro Conference of the ANC, where they adopted a new strategy and tactics, and the 6-7 years after that, when there were no results in sight, and it was very, very difficult to keep people's morale up. Nevertheless, when 1976 came, the ANC was in sufficiently good shape to be able to absorb a lot of these people from 1976 and to enter the country and make, for the first time, some strikes by MK inside the country. Must remember that MK, as Joe Slover used to say, never fired a shot in anger until about 1976. And after that period, they hit police stations, a number of things like that. But I think the ANC, what made them better prepared than others, they made it very clear to the young people, many of whom just want to go back and kill the whites, that what they were concerned about was not having a person behind a gun. They wanted to know who was the person behind the gun, what was it that they wanted to achieve, and they wanted to be sure that they wanted to achieve a particular type of society, not just to kill some people.
But was it the ANC that liberated the country? Was its role not exaggerated compared with the internal revolt and the external pressures?
Well, some of those organizations were connected with the ANC, but I think it's very important that we should not single out a single factor as leading to the negotiated settlement that created democratic elections and democratic constitution, because it is very, very important that there was this growing external pressure manifested in solidarity movements, withdrawal of investments, pressure on the South African banks, things like that. Secondly, the rise of the internal struggle in the late 1970s was very important. Now, some people say MK didn't liberate the country. Now, I don't know who has said MK alone has liberated the country. The important thing about having a military wing is that, on the one hand, the government of the apartheid regime had to allot some forces to be able to combat MK. And they did attack police stations, military installations, but also when there were resistance to forced removals and things like this, sometimes MK would hit those particular police stations, or they would hit police stations that were notorious for torture and things like this. So MK was not capable of defeating the apartheid regime militarily. However, it raised the morale of people, partly because many of people, including myself, thought MK was more powerful than it was, and we got very excited when we heard about these attacks. And that excitement inspired people to be more daring in what was done inside the country. So the key factors were the popular resistance inside the country, underground preparation, because ANC never died. There were a lot of veterans left behind who rebuilt the ANC as an underground force. And underground forces are not visible, but they were able in many cases to advise some of these young people, but also to help them to get out of the country when they needed to get out of the country. then there was MK and the international solidarity. The combined effect of all of these was to make it impossible for the apartheid regime to have sustainable governance for the long term. Consequently, and because on the other side, the liberation forces couldn't defeat the regime militarily, that is a condition which is propitious for negotiations which happened.
Currently, the ANC is very divided. Do you think that there is sufficient holding it together for it to overcome these problems and be a leading factor in SA politics?
It's very, very hard to. I'm not into forecasting. However, we must remember for the start that we depend for our understanding of what's happening in the ANC on media and to some extent scholarship, and the scholarship is usually published when it is 2-3 years old. And most of the reports that we hear of what happens in the big cities. Now, what happens in the big cities is not necessarily the same as in the rural areas. May well be, and it is my experience, but this is before the Zuma period, that the ANC in many rural areas was a very vibrant organization, very different from some of the machinations that you found in urban areas. I don't want to romanticize it because it would vary quite a lot. I think that the ANC is not going to go away tomorrow, although I would not exclude the possibility of the ANC imploding, or the ANC, like the Indian Congress in India, remaining in existence, but losing all the qualities that many people associated with the organization in the period when it held the moral high ground, when it led the struggle for the liberation of South Africa. However, when you change leaders, it is possible that it can inaugurate a whole lot of other things within an organization, sort of vacuum cleaning, reinvigoration in general. And I don't know whether some new candidate will emerge who could possibly rally people in this way. But one must bear in mind the ANC at the moment is built on patronage and corruption as well. And that is not political. So it's not really a political organization in the way it was 20-something years ago. And it's very difficult to forecast what will happen in the future, but and I don't want to put my money on a particular horse.
Thanks for speaking with us, Professor. That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about whether the ANC will survive.